I'm joined today by Judy Wajcman, professor of sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. It's so great to have you on. I've been reading much of what you've written and much of what you've said about the impact of modern technology, smartphone technology, what some consider the increased speed or acceleration of technology, and how that impacts day-to-day lives. And you take a sort of not adversarial, but a different point of view than many who have written about this. There's this sort of predominant view that people's anxiety level, people's feeling pressured for time or short on time is being increased by the availability of smartphones, connections to internet, being able to look at Facebook feeds, etc. You take a sort of different approach about the impact of technology. Let's start there. What is your view about this?
Well, you've put it very well, actually. I mean, I wrote my book, Press the Time, because I was very struck by the paradox that all these technologies are sold to us as time-saving, Fitbits, all of these technologies are going to make us more efficient and manage our time better. And yet we all complain about being incredibly busy. And so I figure that this paradox needed explaining, and that actually the sort of picture we get of these technologies is as if we're completely sort of victims of their speed. It's as if sort of the technologies speed us up, make all these demands on us, and we have no choices at all about what we do with them. And it seems to me that actually the technologies enable us to do a lot more things, and we really want to do those things. We really do want to communicate more, be on Facebook, take advantage of these technologies. And also that as a culture, busyness has been valorized as being a very important thing. Like, we actually think that being in the slow lane, not having much to do, is not having a good life, and having a full life and an exciting life and a rich life is a life full of activities. So that it's become the case that if you ask somebody how they are and they say they're busy, it means they're well, everything's fine.
Yeah,
Whereas
I mean, I've read quite a bit about that, and there are a number of social scientists who say that's sort of a problem, right? That busyness has become a virtue where we want to say we're busy, we're overwhelmed, we don't have time to hang out until 3 Fridays from next Wednesday or whatever the case may be, as if this is sort of indicative of our value in society, and that not being busy is somehow indicative of having less worth. But isn't that maybe a problem?
I think it is a problem, and I think American culture is the worst in terms of people not taking holidays and
Yeah.
not valuing leisure. And if you read sort of comparative studies, you do find that somehow leisure is not something that people are sort of striving for, and that there isn't a discussion anymore about a shorter working week and how we could sort of reorganize society so that we'd have more time for things we want to do. And so I think people's solution is to sort of multitask, to try and do lots and lots of things and do them very quickly, as if the more you pursue this strategy, the more time you'll have. But actually you don't have more time in the end, because actually having control of time is about setting priorities. And as you say, that's not just about individuals setting priorities, but about the culture as a whole setting priorities that aren't just about work and productivity and using time productively, but actually having more vacations, more leisure, and more time to connect with other people.
And you've pushed back sort of against the deterministic type approaches to technology and its impact on society. And you cite the example of the telephone. All of a sudden, when people could just call each other, there were those who said, oh, this is going to completely upend the way people interact with each other. There's going to be this ability to just call people, and thus it's going to create anxiety about making sure that you are in touch with people. But the reality is that society sort of evolved along with the technology as opposed to being determined by the technology, didn't it?
I'm so glad you raised that. I mean, one of the main things I try and do in the book is to talk about how we think we're in a unique historical period, and how there have been previous historical periods of vast radical technological change where people were making amazingly similar comments about the death of distance, the annihilation of time. And if you look back at discussions, whether it's the telegraph, the speed of trains, all of these technologies actually were accompanied by incredible claims, electricity, that these technologies were kind of magic, would completely sort of disorient people, that people wouldn't be able to sort of think anymore, that the language would be completely changed. And I was so struck going back and reading those debates, how a lot of the claims that were made then about a completely new sort of sense of time absolutely sort of predate and are prescient of the sort of things we think now. And it's very important always with these debates to consider how new something like email is. That actually, when I started working on technology now 30 years ago, someone talked to me about the landline, how important the landline was. And I literally looked at the landline and said, but that's not really a technology. I'm talking about microelectronics. I didn't even sort of recognize it as a technology because we so take it for granted. It's so natural. And it's hard to reflect on what email overload will look like in 10, 20 years' time. And already the way we deal with email, I would argue, is very different than the way we dealt with it when it was new and we were excited and we immediately answered all our emails because of this great capacity. We're all finding ways now of integrating these technologies and responding to them differently. And over time, vast new technologies are integrated into everyday life, and after a certain number of years, we don't even notice them. They're just part of everyday life, part of the furniture.
You've talked about the possible, alleged, supposed, possible time pressures that are created by technology, or the relationship between modern technology and sort of society along gender lines. And this may be something much of our audience has not heard. I'd love to hear you tell us a little bit about that. And then, of course, I have some questions about it.
Well, there are 2 points I try and make about that. I mean, one is that actually if you look at sociological data, which I do on surveys, you find that the most time-pressed people are actually working mothers, that it's couples who are both working full-time with children who are the most time-pressed, and particularly working women, mothers are the most time-pressed. And so we have a vast debate about the technology making people time-pressed, but not a vast debate about actually, well, who is it really? It's really mothers, working mothers who are time-pressed. And actually, I'd argue that in that context, the technologies are have very ambivalent effects, and that actually it is true that for mothers and parents to be in touch with kids via the mobile phone has been a fantastic thing, has been a very liberating thing, has enabled women to much more integrate home and work. This is not to say that there's also pressures of being susceptible to work calls and consciousness about work 24/7. But I'd say that there are real positive and negatives. And actually, if you interview people, they say exactly this. They say the worst thing about the phone, is that you're always in contact, and that the best thing about the phone is that you're always in contact. And we live with both sides, I think, of that conundrum.
So in a sense, is it fair to say that the primary caretaker of children in a family, which tends to be disproportionately women versus men in sort of traditional family arrangements, is going to both be particularly aided by these new technologies, but at the same time particularly at risk to be negatively affected by those same technologies?
I mean, I think that's right. And I think that some of the problem with the debate has been this notion that if you communicate via new media and via Facebook, that somehow subtracts from face-to-face interaction. And what you find if you look at parents and kids with each other is that a lot of the new media interaction is, in addition, enriches a lot of the other interactions. So I'm sure all parents have had the experience that I've had, which is that if you Skype with your children who are away, they're much more likely to stay on much longer, have a much better conversation with you. I mean, it's not that these technologies somehow denigrate communication, which I think is often said in a lot of the sort of popular literature.
Well, but there is some gray area, right? I mean, we can say if any of these new technologies for communication are additive, okay, that may be, and we can sort of research that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is some evaluation that we can do about the quality of communications. If you say, well, in person versus Skype versus a Facebook chat versus 140 characters on Twitter versus maybe some new platform where you get 50 characters. At some point, the means of communication is going to be qualitatively worse in some way that we could describe, wouldn't it?
Well, I agree with the point in general, but the point I'd like to make in relation to that is that there is a real tendency to romanticize a previous period of parenting as if parents were spending more time talking to their children than they do today. But actually, if you look at the data, what you find is that we have never lived in a period where parents spend so much time intensively interacting with children. And I actually talk about this as being the intensification of parenthood, that our expectations of what it is to be a parent have never been higher. And so I'd argue that actually we're in a historical period where we spend much more time. And when I say I mean actually communicating with children, not just being with children, not just sitting them in front of the television, but that we all now have an expectation that we should really spend a lot of time playing and communicating with children. And we are doing that more than ever before, even though we're supposed to feel guilty about not doing enough of this.
I'll remind you, the book is pressed for time, available soon in paperback. We've been speaking with the book's author, Judy Wajcman, professor of sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Very, very interesting. I really appreciate you being on with us.
Thank you very much.